The hum of the plane's engines droned steadily as passengers settled into their seats, the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the cabin. At 30,000 feet, where people often lose themselves in books, movies, or quiet contemplation, a storm was quietly brewing, one that no one on Flight 372 could have predicted. David Kingsley adjusted his custom-made suit, the sleek lines tailored perfectly to his lean frame. He wasn't just another passenger in first class. He was the David Kingsley, a self-made billionaire whose tech innovations had revolutionized industries. Despite his immense wealth, David carried himself with a calm, unassuming demeanor. He learned long ago that humility often opened doors arrogance could slam shut. Tonight, however, his attempt to keep a low profile seemed doomed from the start. Across the aisle, the flight attendant, Lisa, worked briskly, her smile tight and her tone clipped as she handed out pre-flight drinks. To the untrained eye, Lisa seemed like any other professional stewardess. Her uniform pristine, her hair swept neatly into a bun. But beneath the surface, tension rippled like an invisible undercurrent. She'd been under pressure for weeks now, overworked and increasingly frustrated by the endless stream of passengers with endless demands. As she approached David, he smiled politely. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, steady voice. "May I have a glass of water, please?" Lisa barely glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You'll have to wait. We're still preparing for takeoff." Her tone was sharp enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby passengers. David blinked, caught off guard by the curt reply. "I understand," he replied evenly, "but I noticed you've been serving others." There was no malice in his tone, just a quiet observation, but something about it seemed to ignite a spark in Lisa. Her face tightened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I said you'll have to wait," she repeated, louder this time. A hush fell over the immediate area. Several passengers turned their heads, sensing the brewing confrontation. David, ever composed, nodded slightly. "Of course," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "I'll wait." But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it seemed to thicken, wrapping around the two like an invisible cord pulling tighter. Minutes passed, and Lisa continued her rounds, but her demeanor grew increasingly brittle. Whether it was the stress of the job or something more personal simmering beneath the surface, she seemed unable to let the interaction go. Her movements became sharper, her tone more clipped, until finally, as she passed by David's seat again, something snapped. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice laced with thinly veiled irritation. Her words hung in the air, louder than intended, drawing the attention of even more passengers. David looked up from his tablet, his expression calm but curious. "No problem at all," he replied. "I was just waiting for the water." Lisa's cheeks flushed, a mix of embarrassment and anger. For a moment, it seemed as though she might simply walk away, but then, as if propelled by something beyond reason, she did the unthinkable. She raised her hand and slapped him. The sound of the impact reverberated through the cabin, a sharp crack that silenced every murmur, every rustle of movement. Gasps rippled through the rows of seats. A child in the row behind them whispered a confused, "Mommy, what happened?" But no one answered. All eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in first class. David's head turned slightly with the force of the slap, his cheek reddening where Lisa's hand had landed. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Lisa's eyes widened in horror as the reality of her actions sank in. The color drained from her face, and her hand trembled at her side. She stammered, searching for words, but none came. David, however, remained unnervingly calm. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to her, his eyes steady and piercing. He didn't yell or lash out. Instead, he simply leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Noted," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying an unmistakable weight. Lisa's breath hitched, the full gravity of the moment crushing down on her. Around them, passengers began to murmur, whispers of disbelief and outrage spreading like wildfire. A few reached for their phones, surreptitiously recording, while others craned their necks to get a better view. Before anyone could fully process what had just happened, David calmly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few swift taps, he sent a message. The screen lit up briefly before the phone disappeared back into his pocket, but those who caught a glimpse of it noticed one chilling detail. The words, "Make the call." Lisa's breathing quickened. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what came over me. David held up a hand, silencing her. "Let's not make this worse than it already is," he said, his tone even but firm. By now, a member of the flight crew had hurried over, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing between David and Lisa. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a sip of the water that had finally arrived and set the glass down with deliberate precision. Only then did he speak, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something that sent a chill through the air. "Let's just say," he began, "this flight is about to take an unexpected turn." And with that, the wheels of a much larger story began to turn. Unseen forces were already in motion, and as the plane continued its journey through the night sky, it became increasingly clear that for Lisa, and perhaps for everyone aboard, things would never be the same again. The flight attendant, Lisa, stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process the enormity of what she'd just done. Around her, the cabin buzzed with the murmurs of passengers who couldn't decide whether they were shocked, outraged, or simply intrigued by the unfolding drama. David Kingsley, however, remained the picture of calm, his composed demeanor only heightening the tension in the air. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what make the call meant, but the way he had said it, with quiet authority, like someone accustomed to getting results, sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just any passenger. This was a man who could ruin her life with a single word. The other flight attendant, a younger woman named Claire, hurried over and gently touched Lisa's arm. "Are you okay?" Claire whispered, her eyes darting nervously between Lisa and David. Lisa nodded stiffly, her voice catching as she said, "I'm fine. It was a misunderstanding." Claire looked skeptical but didn't press. She turned to David, her tone cautious but professional. "Sir, is there anything we can do to make this right? I deeply apologize for any inconvenience." David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, glancing out the window at the vast, dark sky beyond. His profile was sharp and unreadable, his silence only adding to the weight of the moment. When he finally spoke, his words were calm but deliberate, like someone choosing every syllable with care. "What's done is done," he said. "Now let's see how it plays out." The cryptic response sent a ripple of unease through the crew members. Lisa felt her stomach churn as she tried to focus on steadying her breathing. She had been in difficult situations before, angry passengers, emergencies, even a few mid-air medical crises, but this was different. There was something about David's composure, his refusal to escalate or even demand an immediate apology, that felt far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. The pilot, Captain Miller, had been informed of the incident and summoned Lisa to the cockpit for a brief conversation. As she walked up the aisle, passengers leaned into their seats, whispering in hushed tones. Some glared at her in disapproval, while others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. Once inside the cockpit, the door clicked shut behind her, and the muted roar of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the tense conversation. Captain Miller turned in his seat, his brow furrowed with concern. "Lisa," he began, his voice low and firm, "what the hell happened back there?" I lost my temper," Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake. I don't know what came over me." "You slapped a passenger," Miller said bluntly, "and not just any passenger. Do you even know who that man is?" Lisa shook her head, her face pale. "No, I didn't realize he was someone important." Miller exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. "David Kingsley. He's one of the wealthiest men in the world. Owns half of Silicon Valley, for God's sake. You couldn't have picked a worse person to cross." The weight of the name hit Lisa like a blow. She'd heard of David Kingsley, of course, who hadn't? His face had graced magazine covers. His innovations had been lauded as revolutionary, and his business empire was the stuff of legends. But here on this plane, he had just been another passenger, and in her frustration, she had made the worst mistake of her career. "I'll apologize," she said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'll explain it was a misunderstanding." Miller shook his head. "It's not that simple. Someone like Kingsley doesn't need apologies. He doesn't need to raise his voice or cause a scene. People like him have power that works in silence. One phone call, Lisa, one word from him, and you'll be out of this job. Maybe worse." Lisa's knees felt weak, and she gripped the back of her seat for support. "What do I do?" she whispered. Miller studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "For now, you go back out there and keep your head down. Do your job, be polite, and pray that he lets this go." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, David remained seated, scrolling through his phone with a calm expression that belied the turmoil brewing around him. The murmurs of the passengers were like white noise, barely registering as he typed a message. "Update me when it's done." He sent the text and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face unreadable. A man like David didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His power was in his network, his ability to influence events from the shadows. But beneath the calm surface there was a quiet storm brewing. The slap wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge, an affront to the respect he had worked so hard to command. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. The other passengers couldn't stop stealing glances at David, wondering what he might do. Some sympathized with Lisa, thinking she had simply made a mistake under stress. Others believed she deserved whatever consequences were coming her way. Hours passed and the plane cruised steadily through the night sky. Lisa returned to her duties, her hands trembling slightly as she served drinks and collected trash. She avoided eye contact with David, but she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her. At one point, a passenger in the row behind him leaned forward and whispered, "Sir, I just wanted to say, I saw what happened, and that was completely uncalled for. If you need a witness or anything, I'd be happy to help." David turned slowly to face the man, offering a polite but distant smile. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that." The man nodded, looking somewhat reassured, but David's response didn't give much away. Whatever he was planning, he was keeping it close to the chest. Meanwhile, Lisa's anxiety continued to mount. Every glance from a passenger felt like a judgment. Every interaction with the crew felt strained. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, and the anticipation was worse than any punishment could have been. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed, and the flight attendants prepared for landing. Lisa forced herself to focus on the routine tasks, hoping to make it through the rest of the flight without incident. But as the wheels touched down on the tarmac and the plane taxied to the gate, her heart sank. She spotted two men in suits waiting just outside the jet bridge, their expressions unreadable. David stood as the seatbelt sign turned off, his movements deliberate and composed. He adjusted his suit jacket, then turned to face Lisa one last time. "Good luck," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of finality. And with that, he stepped off the plane, leaving Lisa to face whatever awaited her beyond the cabin doors. Lisa remained rooted to her spot near the cabin door, her palms clammy and her breath shallow. The two men in suits hadn't moved an inch since the jet bridge came into view, their polished shoes planted firmly on the ground like sentinels. She couldn't be sure they were there for her, but the timing was too suspicious to ignore. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Passengers began firing off the plane, some casting curious glances her way, others pretending not to notice her unease. David Kingsley, on the other hand, had disappeared into the terminal without a backward glance, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet his parting words, "Good luck," echoed ominously in her mind. Claire brushed past Lisa, giving her a sympathetic squeeze on the shoulder before stepping into the aisle to guide the remaining passengers. "Hang in there," she whispered under her breath. Lisa swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain a professional demeanor as she waited for her turn to leave the aircraft. When the last passenger had disembarked, she grabbed her bag and took a deep breath. Whatever was waiting for her beyond that door, she couldn't avoid it forever. As she stepped into the terminal, the two men in suits turned their attention to her. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, nodded in her direction. "Lisa Reynolds?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Her stomach dropped. "Ah, yes," she stammered. "We'd like to have a word with you." The man continued, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the terminal. His partner, a stockier man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped aside to let her pass. Lisa's legs felt like lead as she followed them, her mind spinning with questions. Who were they? Lawyers? Corporate representatives? Or something worse? When they reached a small seating area away from the flow of passengers, the silver-haired man pulled out a sleek tablet and tapped the screen. "My name is Alan Grayson," he said. "I represent Mr. Kingsley's interests. This is my colleague Martin." Lisa's throat went dry. I didn't mean to." Grayson held up a hand, cutting her off. "Before you say anything, let me be clear. Mr. Kingsley has no intention of pursuing legal action against you yet." The word "yet" hung in the air like a storm cloud. Lisa's knees threatened to give out, but she managed to stay standing. Grayson continued, his tone neutral but authoritative. "However, your actions on board the flight were unacceptable. Mr. Kingsley values respect and professionalism, especially in public settings. The incident you initiated has already gained attention online." Lisa blinked, her heart sinking further. "Online?" Martin nodded, his expression grim. Several passengers recorded the altercation. Videos are circulating on social media. While Mr. Kingsley has chosen not to comment, Public opinion has taken notice. Lisa's mind reeled. She hadn't even considered that possibility. The slap, the gasps, David's calm reaction. It was all out there now for the world to see. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said desperately. "I was under so much stress, and I made a mistake." Grayson studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. "Mistakes have consequences, Ms. Reynolds. Fortunately for you, Mr. Kingsley believes in giving people opportunities to make amends." Lisa's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Grayson leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "You'll receive instructions soon. Mr. Kingsley expects your full cooperation. If you comply, it may be possible to resolve this matter discreetly. If you choose not to, well, let's just say the alternative won't be pleasant." Lisa's mouth went dry. She wanted to ask what kind of instructions he meant, but something in Grayson's tone warned her not to push further. "Do you understand?" he asked, his voice firm. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Good." Grayson stood, slipping the tablet back into his briefcase. "You'll be contacted shortly. I suggest you stay attentive to your phone." With that, the two men walked away, leaving Lisa standing alone in the terminal. Her thoughts spiraled in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What kind of amends could someone like David Kingsley possibly want from her? And what would happen if she failed? Back in the city, David was already moving on to the next phase of his plan. Seated in the back of a black luxury sedan, he stared out the window as the car glided through the glittering streets. Beside him, his assistant, Elena, tapped away on a tablet, her expression calm and focused. "The video has already reached over 1 million views," Elena said, glancing up briefly. "Comments are mixed. Some sympathize with the flight attendant, but most are appalled by her behavior. Public sentiment is leaning in your favor." David smirked faintly but didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he said, "What about the internal report from the airline?" "It's in progress," Elena replied. "They'll likely place her on suspension pending further investigation. Standard procedure." David nodded, his gaze still fixed on the passing cityscape. "Good, let them handle the formalities. I'm more interested in how she handles the situation herself." Elena hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "If I may ask, why not press charges? Or let the airline terminate her? It would send a clear message." David turned to face her, his expression calm but calculating. "Because sometimes the best lessons aren't taught through punishment. They're taught through understanding what's at stake and earning redemption." Elena nodded, though she didn't fully understand his reasoning. She worked for David long enough to know he always had a deeper strategy at play, even when it wasn't immediately obvious. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone as if it might bite her. Every time it buzzed with a notification, her heart leaped into her throat. But hours passed and no instructions came. The waiting was agony, each minute stretching into an eternity. When her phone finally rang, she nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. "Ms. Reynolds," a smooth voice replied. "This is Alan Grayson. Are you prepared to hear the terms of your arrangement?" Lisa gripped the phone tighter. "Yes," she said, barely able to breathe. "Good," Grayson said. "Here are the details." What followed left Lisa reeling. David Kingsley's idea of making amends was nothing like she had imagined, and as Grayson outlined the plan, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. This was only the beginning, and the path ahead promised to be more challenging than she could have ever anticipated. Lisa's heart pounded as she listened to Grayson's instructions, each word adding weight to the pit forming in her stomach. David Kingsley's idea of redemption was far from simple. It wasn't an apology letter or a public statement. It was something much bigger, something she couldn't fully grasp yet. "You'll report to the Kingsley Foundation's headquarters tomorrow morning," Grayson said over the phone, his tone businesslike but firm. "From there, you'll be given specific tasks. Your participation is non-negotiable if you wish to avoid escalation." "What kind of tasks?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "That will be explained when you arrive," Grayson replied. "For now, understand this. Mr. Kingsley values effort and accountability. This is your chance to demonstrate both." Before she could ask more, the line went dead, leaving Lisa alone in her dimly lit apartment. The silence felt deafening. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. She didn't know what awaited her, but the sheer precision of Grayson's tone made it clear this wasn't just a casual gesture. Kingsley wanted something from her, something more than an apology. The next morning, Lisa arrived at the Kingsley Foundation's sleek glass tower, her stomach churning with anxiety. The lobby was pristine, filled with polished marble and hushed conversations. Everyone seemed to move with purpose, their footsteps echoing softly against the floor. Lisa felt out of place in her simple attire, her nerves showing in the way she clutched her bag. At the reception desk, a woman with a warm but professional demeanor greeted her. "Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Grayson is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 17th floor." Lisa nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you before stepping into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The ride felt interminable, the numbers lighting up slowly as the elevator climbed higher. When she stepped onto the 17th floor, she was met by Grayson himself. His suit was immaculate, and his expression betrayed nothing. "Follow me," he said, motioning for her to walk beside him. They passed through a series of glass-walled offices where people worked intently at desks adorned with cutting-edge technology. The energy was palpable, focused, determined, almost intimidating. Finally, Grayson led her into a spacious conference room. At its center was a long table, and seated at the head was David Kingsley. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sharp but composed. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice calm. "Thank you for coming." Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Thank you for giving me the chance," she managed to say, though her voice wavered. David gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, feeling the weight of his attention. "I imagine Grayson explained the basics," he began. "This isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility. Actions have ripple effects, Ms. Reynolds, and I believe in teaching people to understand them." Lisa nodded, unsure how to respond. David continued, leaning forward slightly. "The Kingsley Foundation runs numerous outreach programs, education initiatives, disaster relief, innovation projects in underserved areas. You'll be working with one of these teams, directly seeing the impact of the work we do." Lisa blinked, confused. "You want me to help with charity work?" David's expression didn't change. "I want you to understand what it means to contribute. You'll assist with a project we're funding, a clean water initiative in a rural community. Your role will involve coordinating resources, managing logistics, and ensuring the team has everything they need." It sounded straightforward, but Lisa could sense there was more to it. "Why me?" she asked hesitantly. David's eyes met hers, unflinching. "Because you need this as much as they do." The words struck a chord, though Lisa couldn't fully explain why. She nodded slowly, her nerves still on edge, but tempered by a growing determination. Whatever this was, she would face it. Grayson handed her a folder filled with documents and information about the project. "Your flight leaves in 2 days," he said. "Pack light." Lisa's mind reeled. She had expected something intimidating, maybe even humiliating, but this was entirely different. As she left the building, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. She felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. What exactly was David Kingsley trying to teach her? 2 days later, Lisa found herself on another flight. This time not as a flight attendant, but as a passenger on her way to an unfamiliar destination. The plane touched down in a remote area, and she was met by a local guide who drove her to the project site. The village was small, nestled amid rolling hills and dense greenery. Children played near dusty roads, their laughter mingling with the sounds of daily life. The air was warm, carrying the scent of earth and blooming flowers. Lisa stepped out of the vehicle, her senses overwhelmed by the stark contrast to the world she knew. A woman named Nadia, the team leader, greeted her with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. "You must be Lisa. We're glad to have you here." Lisa nodded, still taking in her surroundings. "I'm here to help," she said, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure what she could offer. Over the next few days, Lisa was thrust into the heart of the project. She helped unload supplies, coordinated with local leaders, and even got her hands dirty assisting with the construction of water filtration systems. The work was physically demanding and emotionally draining, but it was also eye-opening. She saw firsthand the challenges the community faced: limited access to clean water, long walks to distant wells, and health issues that could have been avoided with better resources. The team worked tirelessly, their dedication unwavering. Lisa found herself inspired by their passion, but she also felt out of place. She wasn't like them. She was here because she'd made a mistake, not because she cared, or at least, that's what she thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lisa sat with Nadia, watching the villagers gather around a communal fire. Children laughed and played, their joy infectious. "This is why we do it," Nadia said softly. "It's not just about clean water. It's about giving people a chance at a better life." Lisa nodded, her throat tight. For the first time, she began to see the bigger picture. Her actions on that flight had been thoughtless, driven by frustration and stress. But here in this village, she was learning what it meant to take responsibility, not just for herself, but for the world around her. As the days passed, Lisa's perspective began to shift. The work became less about fulfilling a requirement and more about making a difference. She started to connect with the villagers, learning their stories and understanding their resilience. The more she gave, the more she felt she was receiving in return. But as Lisa's understanding deepened, so too did her awareness that her time here was limited. She didn't know what awaited her when she returned to her regular life, or how David Kingsley would judge her efforts. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to being the person she was before. The tension between her past and present grew stronger with each passing day, building toward an inevitable confrontation. Lisa knew the climax of this journey was approaching, but she couldn't predict what it would bring, or how it would change her forever. The final days of Lisa's assignment in the village brought a bittersweet mix of accomplishment and uncertainty. The water filtration systems were nearly complete, and the community's gratitude was palpable. Children ran to greet her each morning, their laughter now mingled with hope, while the villagers smiled warmly whenever she passed by. It was a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent stares she had endured on the flight after the incident. For the first time in weeks, Lisa felt like she was doing something meaningful. Yet the lingering question of what David Kingsley truly intended loomed over her. As Lisa packed her belongings for the journey back, Nadia approached her with a thoughtful expression. "You've done good work here," she said, her tone kind but measured. "But I feel like something's still weighing on you." Lisa hesitated, unsure how much to share. "This started as a way to fix a mistake," she admitted. "But now, I don't know. It feels like there's more to it. Like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." Nadia nodded knowingly. "David Kingsley doesn't do anything without a reason," she said. "If he sent you here, it's because he wanted you to see something. Maybe it's not just about them." She gestured toward the village. "But about you too." Lisa couldn't argue with that. The experience had changed her, but the shadow of Kingsley's influence still felt overwhelming. She wondered if she'd truly proven anything, or if this was just the beginning of something even larger. The ride back to the airport was quiet, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. When Lisa boarded the plane home, she couldn't help but feel the tension creeping back into her chest. It wasn't like the warm camaraderie she'd found in the village. This was the cold, sterile atmosphere of her old life, and she wasn't sure she belonged in it anymore. When she landed, Grayson was waiting for her at the arrival's gate. His expression was as inscrutable as ever, but there was a hint of urgency in his usually measured tone. "Welcome back, Ms. Reynolds," he said. "Mr. Kingsley would like to see you immediately." Lisa's pulse quickened. She had expected some kind of debriefing or follow-up, but the immediacy of the request caught her off guard. "Now?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Grayson nodded. "A car is waiting." The drive to Kingsley's private office was tense and silent, the city lights blurring past the windows as Lisa tried to steel herself for whatever awaited her. When she finally stepped into the office, she found David seated behind a massive desk, his focus divided between a sleek tablet and the view of the city skyline behind him. "Ms. Reynolds," he said without looking up. "Have a seat." Lisa sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city below. Finally, David set the tablet down and turned his attention to her. "You've completed your assignment," he began. The feedback from Nadia and the team was positive. They said you worked hard, that you adapted well to the challenges. Lisa felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the tension in his tone. "Thank you," she said quietly. David leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "But that was only part of the test." Lisa froze. "Part of the test?" David nodded, his expression unreadable. "I needed to know if you could step outside yourself, beyond your own mistakes, and see the bigger picture. You've made progress, but there's one more thing." Before Lisa could ask what he meant, David tapped a button on his desk, and a screen lowered from the ceiling. It flickered to life, displaying grainy security footage. Lisa's stomach dropped when she realized what she was watching. It was her, on the flight. The slap. The video showed the entire incident, from Lisa's initial sharp exchange with David to the moment her hand struck his face. The sound of the slap, even through the low-quality audio, sent a wave of shame crashing over her. But what truly unnerved her was what followed. The footage didn't stop there. It continued after David had turned away, capturing a subtle but chilling detail. Another passenger, seated several rows back, typing furiously on their phone. Zooming in, the camera revealed the text on their screen. "This is going to blow up. Uploading now." Lisa's breath caught. "Wait, someone leaked this." David nodded slowly. "Not just someone. This was orchestrated." Lisa blinked, struggling to process his words. "What do you mean?" David stood and began pacing the room, his movements deliberate. "The incident on the plane wasn't just an unfortunate moment. Someone wanted to use it against me. They knew who I was, they knew what a video like this could do, and they were counting on me to react." Lisa's mind raced. But why would anyone do that? What do they have to gain? David stopped, turning to face her. "Power, influence. Undermining me weakens my position, my ability to negotiate deals, even my reputation. You were caught in the middle of something much bigger than you realized." Lisa felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She had been so focused on her own mistakes, her own redemption, that she hadn't even considered the possibility of a larger scheme. "So, I was just collateral damage." "Not just," David said firmly. "You became a focal point. The video made you a target as much as it made me one. But there's more to this than just a smear campaign." He gestured to the screen again, where a different piece of footage now played. This time, it was a group of people in a boardroom, their faces obscured, but their voices clear. They were discussing strategies, throwing around terms like leverage and optics. David's voice cut through the tension. "These are the people behind it, and they're not done. That's why I needed you to understand the weight of your actions, not just for yourself, but for the world you inhabit." Lisa's pulse raced. "What do you need me to do?" David studied her for a long moment. "That depends on you. Are you ready to confront what comes next? To face the consequences and fight back?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lisa knew the stakes had risen far beyond her own personal redemption. She wasn't just dealing with her own mistakes anymore. She was now caught in a battle she barely understood, with forces much larger than herself. But even as fear gripped her, a flicker of resolve began to grow. For the first time, Lisa felt the pull of something greater. A chance to not only make amends, but to stand for something that mattered. She looked David in the eye and nodded, her voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead. "I'm ready."